Okay, and hello, and welcome to this Teachit talk on strategies to help make learning stick. I hope everybody is well. There are a number of strategies which relate to my own subject of MFL and others which relate to other domains in this presentation. These having been previously checked and developed alongside subject teachers in that domain as well. So, brings us on to slide 2. And the first strategy describes a strategy which aims to promote conditions where transfer in writing and speaking could potentially be improved through the endpoint of narrow translation dictations. The endpoint of delivering a narrow translation dictation depends on some prior steps involving practicing and testing of chunks of language first. So part A of this model focuses on what a chunk is, some suggested ways to practice it, as well as to present it. So choosing a chunk of language could depend on the level of versatility the chunk has in its utility across different topics. Clearly the first chunk on this slide here could be transferred across a number of different topics. Not only this, but if the component grammatical features of this chunk had been taught separately at various points, and spontaneity in the transfer of this was expected to take place later, the potential cognitive load related to applying this language in a transfer task could lead to a situation where a learner faces significant cognitive overload. It could be argued that if not taught and tested dozens of times throughout the course, no matter what the topic is, there would be a high level of element interactivity. That is, the number of different knowledge elements needed to be coordinated in working memory at any one time in order to accomplish the task. The task here being one of recall and coordination of all the component parts of the chunk when the transfer context demanded. So teaching and testing the chunk leads to arguably effective transfer. An additional benefit could be in the efficiency of learning more vocabulary, as by learning the first half of the chunk and the second half after, you are learning 2 chunks made up of 4 and 5 words each. So processing 2 items but working with 9 words at the same time. This efficiency in learning is brilliantly defined by a quote from Gianfranco Conti's blog on this same slide. So part A of the narrow translation dictation approach continues with some suggested ways to present and practice a chunk before continuing to part B when it is about chunk retrieval. So by starting with the presentation of a chunk, I enjoy using sentence builders as seen here on the next slide. I also present chunks as on the right hand side, numbered and as an almost pre-packaged set of chunks which all have different high-level features within each chunk. The chunks would all be presented on one slide, and the numbers help with the practicing of the language. And to go back a slide just for a moment, 2 to 5 are some of the number of ways of practicing chunks that could take place. Vocab piler, sentence stealer, random, verbal volley, and there are of course others. So something like random on here could work simply by projecting a set of chunks or a sentence builder and firing out parts of the English and waiting for the translation called out by the students. So for instance, using the 1 to 8 there, even just a part of that chunk could be called out, si fuera posible, and then allow for whichever student then to call out the English meaning for that, and then maybe wins the point for their team. This brings us onto really the next stage in the preparation of narrow translation dictations. The stage of chunk retrieval, again, could take place through a number of strategies. These could be through an activity like a penalty shootout, where you project a set of chunks to the class and one side turns their backs while the other side, well, the side turns their backs to the board so they can't see, obviously, the translation, while the other side has a quick discussion using the numbers to refer to, for instance, in terms of the most demanding chunk meanings that they think the side with their backs to the board will not be able to recall perfectly, before then having one student call it out to the whole side with their backs to the board, who then have a 10-second discussion time limit before one student calls out what that side thinks the meaning is. If the translation is correct, then the side having called out the chunk initially have had their penalty saved and is marked on the board accordingly. If the meaning is not translated correctly, then the side who initially called it out have scored the penalty. The process would then continue with the side calling out the first chunk, now turning their backs to the board, and vice versa. An additional way to test retrieval of these key chunks would be to provide a handout or simply project a set of chunks in target language with the English translation and then an additional set of 3 very similar chunks below, with some of the underlying features in each chunk kept constant and surface features changed each time. And really, as described by Gianfranco Conti and Steve Smith, which I've actually found to be one of the most effective strategies, is simply to read aloud phrases or sentences to translate, as we can see here with number 2. Of course, I also use additional ways to test the narrow translations of chunks themselves by presenting a chunk like this and then getting students to translate A, B, and C by just translating one or one other, perhaps on top of that, surface feature by keeping the underlying structures the same each time. This now brings us on to the final step of putting together narrow translation dictations. So to help make the potential conditions of transfer to a written or spoken task, or cue, more effective. So a proposed model of narrow translation dictations could involve the teacher dictating the English as shown on the screen without the students being able to see it. So the teacher would dictate slowly and would ask that the students write in target language, but if they did not know the meaning of part of the dictation, they would simply note the English for those parts, as opposed to leave that part blank. The idea behind this being that when you go through the correct translation, both you and they can monitor what was known and not known as a written record. In fact, even before going through the whole translation, I would ask the students as a whole class which parts didn't stick that well and why, and so on. Once the first dictation had occurred, then the narrow approach would continue, so you would then dictate the next piece. This next piece would be on school. Again, the students would not be able to see that, and you would continue with the dictation. And of course, crucially for this dictation and the third one, the underlying structures, things like which has just been and if I were to have the opportunity I would like to do it more often, are retained throughout each dictation. But there are minor amendments to the surface structure. The process would then finish with the third dictation. Because the dictation passages contain the chunks, there could then be a discussion around which are the most difficult chunks to recall and why, how students might generate more chunks, and through what, basically, and through and how they would adapt them and why, they would adapt those chunks, and so on. The final step, the next step then, would be for students to possibly transfer this knowledge to a practice written task as shown in the bullets here, or even to aim to get learners to write with a level of automaticity enhanced by these narrow translation dictations when responding to a simple cue like write all that you can about holidays. And that's the proposed process behind chunks and narrow translation dictations. So those would be the cues that would be that you may aim to sort of work towards, just simple cue to trigger the retrieval of all that you could write using that knowledge that had been practiced through those narrow translation dictations. Strategy 2 is another MFL specific example. This next strategy is another example then of, it's still got an element, of course, of retrieval behind it, but in this context, it's MFL. So after this discussion, though, there is a more generic approach across content, which is next. After this, so free recall brain dumps with MFL in order to help to strengthen whatever knowledge it is that you want learners to strengthen, aims not only to do this, but just as with any content that is brain dumped, it also aims to promote generative learning insofar as learners putting down in their own words in a holistic way the content that has been processed previously. With this MFL specific strategy regarding brain dumps, the strategy could take the following form. Project a cue, like the name of a previously covered tense, and simply train students on writing out as much as they can recall about that tense based on things like the regular formation of the tense translation into English, if there are any irregulars, and so on. You could also plan the brain dump around initially doing a confidence rating of how much learners think that they could recall even before starting. Finally, something I think worth noting is that when I first trialed doing these brain dumps in class, some learners struggled to recall when the cue was solely presented as the name of the tense, as in, say, 1, 2, 3, and a few of the others on the left-hand side on that slide. Really, this was because the cue was a cue that I had generated myself, and it wasn't a cue which was generated by themselves, by the students themselves, by the learners themselves. So I varied the type of retrieval cue and therefore changed it to include a mix of names of tenses, Spanish examples, and English translations of the tense to act as a more varied set of retrieval cues. So for instance, of course, on this slide here were the variations. I am going to eat, instead of just present tense, present continuous, the names of the tense. So, you know, había comido, I have arrived, etc. Write everything out you can according to that cue. So finally, as it can initially, as it can initially appear as quite an odd strategy, I would present a model of how a brain dump might look, as shown in the pale blue box here. That would really be shared with learners and discussed with them as regards to a model of how a brain dump might look. And this brings us on to strategy 3. Now, strategy 3 is also a brain dump, and it also goes and discusses just any really content. This content, of course, is discussing, of course, nuclear radiation, and really just straightforward that students would simply read the passage and then turn the passage over or close it, whatever, so it can't be seen, and in their own words recall all that they could without referring to it. This technique again is referred to in learning as a generative activity. And some variations on this. So on this slide, there is another example which deals with a scheme of learning and brain dump of all that had been covered at various points throughout the year. Students could simply recall all that they could from a simple cue relating to a previous area on a scheme of learning by the teacher perhaps saying, write all that you can about weather hazards, and so on. And as we could see there on this imaginary sort of scheme of learning, weather hazards had been covered, material covered in September. So that brain dump might take place in November or October, or a bit later on in, say, week 4 of the September scheme of learning. This also, the brain dump still could be carried out by a brain dump diagram, or even on, as we can see here, a partially completed mind map, or even just obviously covering it up and then draw out literally everything you can recall from that mind map. And then it brings us finally to the 4th strategy, which involves a set of steps which could be applied to structure a brain dump so that it harnesses the potential of the holistic and targeted retrieval hypothesis. So the holistic hypothesis, holistic retrieval hypothesis, the targeted retrieval hypothesis, with a variety of sort of different content. And there are a set of steps here which could be followed. So you might start by step 1, read the revision guide page or your handout content out loud if possible, with no distractions. So again, let's imagine that was a revision guide section that will be read out. Then turn the revision guide over or cover it up. That will be covered up or turned over. With a black pen on lined paper, write down in your own words, crucially in your own words, as much of that revision guide page as you can recall in, say, 3 minutes. It doesn't have to be 3 minutes, of course, but it's just the time I put down at that point. If the second time round that this recall would take place, I suggested an increase in the number of minutes, of course, because you would expect that a greater level of recall could take place the second time round. Then turn the revision guide back over or uncover it, so you'd look at it again. And then read what you've written, and with a green or a red pen, write out and correct anything that you missed or didn't get right according to the revision guide. So that's where misconceptions would be dealt with, and so on. And then on a separate piece of paper, so you'd pick up a separate piece of paper and then make a question of up to 5 pieces of information that you wrote down in red or green. And you'd put those into what's going to be called the targeted retrieval pile. So those would be short questions made from any of the content that was either put down incorrectly and you corrected it with your different coloured pen, you made a question of that, or just anything that you just hadn't been recalled the first time round. You'd make the question of that as well, just a short question. And then so make a separate space and pile for that. And then step 8, fold over your piece of paper with your first set of notes in black pen and corrections, additions in red, green, so that you can't see what you wrote the first time. And then step 9, repeat steps 1 to 8 2 more times, with step 3 extended to 5 minutes the second time and extended to 7 minutes the third and final time. And then step 10, pick up the paper from the targeted retrieval pile and from memory with a black pen, answer the questions on either this paper or a separate paper. Of course, the targeted retrieval pile could be dealt with another time, a bit later on. Doesn't have to be, those questions don't have to be answered right there and then. The next strategy is an elaborative sort of base strategy, and of course is known as elaborative interrogation. This strategy is one which was identified as being a promising learning strategy in the 2013 Dunlosky study, and is and it's relatively straightforward in its use, in the sense that really you simply make a statement, as we can see in the left hand column, numbered 1 to 3. So a factual statement is made, and then it's turned into a question in the middle column, and then in the third column it's quite simply just answered in the learner's own words, and those are my answers on the right. And of course this strategy could also be applied within texts, so using embedded elaborative interrogation, not just for isolated facts that appear, factual statements that appear on the left in that first column. So the next activity is similar to the previous one in the sense that there is elaboration involved, but it's one which begins with retrieval. It's an idea adapted from the writing revolution, and also really well adapted on Ben Rogers' blog. You would start with a basic statement, as we can see there at the top in bold and underlined, and a set of question words on the left, and then allow learners to recall according to the question words. But once the answers have been checked, then the elaboration on the short answers, see here, so the elaboration on those short answers which had been retrieved would take place to build a piece of writing with a little bit more elaboration when it's been put together, as we can see that I've just put on the slide there. The next strategy would be almost a reverse engineering process to that one. So alternatively, a paragraph could be presented and then answers for each question broken down. And then sometime left for forgetting to occur, and then at a later date the questions with just the answers presented to actually practice putting a paragraph again together. So of course there's different variations and different ways that that strategy could be adopted. This next strategy is related to a strategy highlighted in the book Peak, where it's a strategy. It's a similar strategy used by Benjamin Franklin to write like the writers in The Spectator. And it was based on Benjamin Franklin writing short descriptions of sentences in The Spectator, and then coming back to them later and then rewriting them, aiming to rewrite them almost like the originals, effectively. In any case, a potential strategy involving this could be to simply read a text, write a description of each sentence, as in the pale blue box at the bottom of the slide, before then allowing for some forgetting time, and then trying to rewrite out a similar piece of writing based on this description. And then the final strategy to discuss is one which features in the Dunlosky study, as well as being a strategy referred to in generative learning, and that's self-explanation. The idea behind self-explanation, and if we just click onto that slide, we can see in a bit more detail. So the idea behind self-explanation is that simply you explain the steps that you take as you work through a set of procedures using a series of, in this case, content-free prompts, like, for example, how does this information relate to what I already know, and so on. The idea that it's the idea is that it should be self-explanation that is worked through when solving a problem, as we can see on the left here, a potential problem, and not paraphrasing or monitoring. And that would be an example on the left there of some of my commentary, my written commentary on the self-explanation I used when solving the this problem on the left. Okay, and that's it. That's the end of the presentation. I hope that this has provided some strategies to consider when discussing and thinking of ways to help make learning stick. Many thanks and take care all.